Shalom to you, my friends. My name is Isaac from Trego Studios. Today I want to show you the basic settings you need to know when you are setting up your camera for your church services. Generally, when you are setting up your camera, the basic thing you should have in mind is having a proper exposure, a good exposure. That is, your composition is not underexposed, that is where it is getting dark, or overexposed, that is where it is getting bright. How do you know when your composition is overexposed? When your composition is overexposed, the bright areas on your composition is going to be washed out. When I say washed out, what I mean is that you are not going to be able to define the details in the composition. And when your shot is underexposed, it makes the image very dark, so you won't be able to clearly see what's going on in the shot. So how do you achieve a good exposure when you're setting up your camera? Now, there are three basic things on the camera, on any camera, that affects the exposure of your camera. The first is the shutter speed, the second is the aperture, and the third is the ISO. These three things can be set on a camera, either you're using a prosumer camera or a DSLR or a professional video camera, whatever it is. You should be able to set it. Although some cameras might name it differently, it might not be named as ISO. For instance, on most professional video cameras, you have it as gain, and you have your aperture, and you have your shutter speed. Now, how does these three things affect your exposure? Now, starting with the shutter speed. The shutter speed is actually a measurement of time. It is the time it takes for your shutter, the shutter on your camera, to open and close. And what's the shutter? When you are snapping, that thing you hear that makes a sound after you snap a picture is actually the shutter opening and closing. Because your video also consists of a series of still images that is combined together. So how does the shutter speed affect the exposure of your composition? Now, increase in the value of the shutter speed makes your composition darker, and reducing the shutter speed makes your composition brighter. So for instance, a shutter speed of 125 is going to be darker than a shutter speed of 50. But there's a basic rule for setting your shutter speed when you are shooting video, and the rule is your shutter speed should be twice the value of your frame rate. That is, when you are shooting at a frame rate of 25 frames per second, then your shutter speed should be twice of that, which is 25 times 2, which is 50. So your shutter speed should be 50. The second thing that controls your exposure is your aperture. Now, your aperture is like a window on your lens. It opens and it closes. So how does the aperture affect the exposure of your composition? Now, the lower the aperture, the brighter the image, or the brighter your composition, and the higher the aperture, then the darker the composition. So in other words, when your aperture has a lower value, it increases the brightness of your composition. But if your aperture has a higher value, then it decreases the brightness or the exposure of your composition. Now, the third thing that controls your exposure is the ISO. The ISO basically is how your camera becomes more sensitive or less sensitive to the light in the scene. So if your ISO is set high, your camera will be more sensitive to light, and if your ISO is less or lower, then it will be less sensitive to light. So if you want a composition to get brighter, then you have to increase the ISO value, and if you want to reduce the exposure of your composition, then you have to reduce your ISO. So these are the three things that affect the exposure of your composition. Most times when you are setting up your camera, you should not have to struggle with changing the shutter speed, because there is a basic rule that applies to the shutter speed, which is 2 times the frame rate at which you are shooting. So if you know you always shoot at 24 frames per second, then you should know that your shutter speed will always be set to 50. So most times you wouldn't have to change that value, no matter the exposure level of your composition. So you have the other 2 factors to control in order to set your exposure properly. If you try to change the value of the shutter speed, there are 2 effects to it. If your shutter speed is set too high, then your movement is not going to be so realistic. If your shutter speed is set too low, then you're going to be seeing a motion blur effect. A motion blur effect is an instance whenever there is a wave or a movement on the composition, then you're going to be seeing a kind of blurriness on the shots if it is set to low. Aperture, on the other hand, when it is set very low, increases the brightness or the exposure of your composition, and it also gives you an effect where your background will be out of focus and your subject will be in focus. So that helps you to define your subject and pulling the eyes of your audience to be centered on what is in focus. The effect of ISO when it is cranked up too high or when you set it too high is that it starts to introduce noise into your shot. So you're not going to have a clean shot if you set your ISO too high. But the effect is going to be different depending on the camera you use. Some might not even be affected by introducing noise even at ISO set to 800. So know your camera and know when this noise is introduced into your camera at some certain ISO. Here's a step I generally follow when I want to set the exposure for my camera. Either my camera is focused on the pastor or it's focused on the audience. Here's a step-by-step process I take. Now, if I'm shooting at 24 frames per second or 25 frames per second, I know that I don't want to touch my shutter speed. So I leave my shutter speed at 1/50 or 50, depending on how your camera displays it. Now, the next thing I consider is the aperture. I also don't want to introduce my ISO yet because of the noise effect that comes with it if I set it too high. So I want to make sure that every other parameters are set before considering my ISO. The ISO is usually the last thing I touch when I'm setting up the exposure for my camera. Before I affect the aperture, I want to make sure that my ISO is first at the least value, so that the ISO is the last thing I'm going to touch because of the noise it introduces into the shots if I am to use it to increase the exposure of my shot. Now, so I'm going to make sure the ISO is set to the least value and then come back to the aperture. Now, if my shot is still dark, then I'm going to open wide my aperture. That is by reducing the value. The lower the value of the aperture, the brighter the images. And different cameras have different aperture value depending on the capacity of your lens. So the lens is actually the one that carries the effect of the aperture. So if your lens can go as low as 1.2, then your camera can be properly exposed even at low light. So if the situation is that my composition is dark, I'm going to reduce my aperture, reduce it to the lowest value or to the value that I know that it's going to give it a proper exposure. And if it is too bright, say you are shooting outside or in a bright or very exposed environment, then I'm going to increase the value of my aperture so that it's going to decrease the exposure of the camera just to balance it up. Now, if my aperture still does not solve my exposure, and most times it will not solve it in the sense that it is still not bright, then I will now come back to the ISO and increase the ISO to make up for the exposure of the composition. And if you find out that even after increasing your ISO, your exposure is still not good and you have to crank up your ISO to a point that is going to be introducing noise, then I think the best option will be for you to introduce more light into the scene. So if it is the pastor you are targeting, then you should introduce more light to the altar or the stage, wherever it is. Introduce more light, more stage light, so that the whole environment itself becomes brighter, and then the camera can be more sensitive to the light of the environment. So that's it, guys. I believe that you've learned one thing or the other in this video. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments below, or if you have any contribution to make as regards this video, then you can also do so also in the comments below. If you have any idea of any questions or any video you want me to do related to this, then you can also write that also in the comments below. So I want you, as a media volunteer in your church, make use of these things you've learned. So the next time you stand before your camera, check for these settings and look for how you can set them. So look for the way to adjust the settings on your camera and apply it. Make sure that you improve in your production. Don't have an overexposed shot. Again, don't have an underexposed shot. Have a proper exposure. There's usually an exposure meter on your camera that reads plus or minus 0. So check the settings on your own camera to know where the exposure value is. If the exposure value is going below 0 or is going to a negative value, then you know you're underexposed. And if your exposure is coming towards the positive side, you know that it is overexposed. If it is coming to the negative side, you know that it is underexposed. Or if it is at 0, the 0 mark, then you know that you're properly exposed. And you can also confirm with your monitor to be sure that the exposure meter is actually reading the correct value for you. So, thank you for staying to the end of this tutorial till I come your way next time with another tutorial. I want you to remain faithful in the Lord's service in the media. God bless you. Bye.